So how do we measure metabolic health? Again, for most of us, looking at the weight on the scale is kind of one of the best things we have at our disposal to understand our health. But as I've already explained, there are lots of limitations when it comes to looking at that number. So is there something else we can turn to? Well, it turns out there is. In the early 1990s, a scientist by the name of Gerald Reaven began to notice something, which was a collection of symptoms that he ended up clustering in something he called Syndrome X, tended to aggregate with people that got all of these metabolic diseases we've spoken so much about. Now, Syndrome X was eventually renamed Metabolic Syndrome, and the syndrome is defined as having 3 or more of the following 5 things being out of whack. So what are those 5 things? Well, waist circumference, which becomes a proxy for truncal adiposity, triglyceride level, glucose level, one type of cholesterol measurement, and blood pressure. So let's explain what the definition of being out of whack means on each of these. And then again, remind ourselves that if 3, 4, 5 of these are out of whack, you have metabolic syndrome. And when you have metabolic syndrome, your risk for these diseases that are ultimately the ones accountable for 80% of deaths, that risk goes up dramatically. So let's start with waist circumference. In a man, a waist circumference exceeding 40 inches. In a woman, a waist circumference exceeding 35 inches is a huge predictor of metabolic disease. Second, we look at triglyceride level. Triglycerides are the storage form of fat, and the higher they are, the more it tells us that our body is very inefficient at storing fat and very inefficient at utilizing fat. So if your triglyceride level exceeds 150 milligrams per deciliter on a standard blood test, that would be the second flag. The third would be glucose level. In fact, specifically fasting glucose level. If the fasting glucose level exceeds 100 milligrams per deciliter, that would be the third flag. The fourth is HDL cholesterol. So the HDL lipoprotein carries cholesterol, and typically the lower the level of that cholesterol, the more we see an increase in metabolic dysfunction. So in men, a level below 40 milligrams per deciliter, and in women, a level below 50 milligrams per deciliter would be a predictor of poor outcome. And lastly, blood pressure. If a person's blood pressure exceeds 130 over 85 millimeters per mercury, that would be the fifth and final sign of metabolic dysregulation. Now, all of these are things you should have measured constantly. In fact, many of these you can measure on your own. The only one that actually requires you going to your doctor or having a blood test would be the triglyceride and the cholesterol level. The others you could measure on your own. And you should know what your values are at all times. And these are just as important, if not far more important, than some of the metrics that people tend to think about, such as the number on the scale. Did you notice that weight was not one of these numbers? So if missing on 3 out of 5 of these is what it means to be unhealthy, let's flip it for a moment. What does it mean to be healthy? Well, what it means to be healthy is to go 0 for 5 and use these as targets of things we want to be improving on. Minimizing our triglycerides, minimizing our fasting glucose, minimizing our blood pressure. That's the way we want to use these metrics of metabolic syndrome to track our health. So it's not just the number on the scale. And frankly, it's not just the amount of fat mass you carry. Those things matter. But as our understanding of metabolic disease goes, these metrics matter even more.